Now we'll take a look at me versus Albert in terms of our forehand technique. We've got Albert on the left who's using a much more traditional technique, and then me on the right using the supposed modern tennis technique for the forehand, which is quite a bit different. But remember, keep in mind these are these are like very awkward practice forehands without a real ball and before warming up. So the footage is a little iffy in that respect, but we'll do what we can. All right, now let me make sure that we loop on the slow motion aspect of the video. All right, cool. So another way to put it is sometimes this is called the ATP tennis forehand versus the traditional forehand, which is sometimes referred to as the WTA, because apparently a lot of people compare it as like men's versus women's. Basically, women just don't use this technique. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but what's going on with the technique is you have more compact swing, so kind of like takes less time to execute, and especially takes less time to set up the swing. The other thing to keep in mind is that in terms of footwork, there's an open stance where if you look at Albert's feet, they are much more in alignment with the camera, whereas my feet are, if you draw a line in between them, they're a little bit more parallel to the net, whereas Albert's feet are definitely more perpendicular to the net. And then when it comes to executing the swing itself, my arm is more focused on just swinging through the ball and swinging forwards, whereas Albert's arm is very much going low to high. My arm, if I just like trace my fist, doesn't go very low and doesn't go very high, whereas Albert's fist goes lower and higher relative to his own body. I think my fist, I don't think it ever goes even as low as the waist. Yeah, it doesn't even get down to the waist level, and it only goes about as high as shoulder level. Whereas kind of at the end of the follow-through, Albert's fist is like all the way at eye level, whereas my fist is more, kind of, I guess, neck level. All right, moving on though. The quote-unquote modern tennis forehand started showing up, I want to say around like 2010, but I'm not entirely sure. And then I started using it around 2014, and it took me, I don't know, at least, I want to say 2 years to get comfortable with it, because for more than a decade already, I had been using the traditional style that Albert is using as well. So it took me a while to learn this different style. Now, the reason I wanted to learn the different style is because I started, at the time, I was playing against a friend who was better than me, and he basically always hit with more spin and more power than I'm used to. And it just took away the amount of time I had to even swing. Like, I had less time to react to his shots. I had less time to set up myself to swing, and I had less time to actually swing through and hit the ball. So when you have this style of swinging with the forehand, then what ends up happening is you basically save time. It just makes it easier to handle faster paced tennis. So a big part of it is just the when we look at the backswing, taking the racket back. If we look at me, then notice how kind of in the beginning, in my ready stance, then I'm holding the racket up, and then I just turn straight back with my upper body. I don't do very much with my arms. Like the arms just sort of stay as they are. Whereas if we look at what Albert's doing for his backswing, his racket arm is doing quite a bit of motion before it even starts swinging forward. So, and when I used to have similar technique to Albert, yeah, it took me basically more time to take the racket backwards before I could take the racket forwards. And then on top of that, when you have open stance feet instead of closed stance feet, then it just takes less time to get your feet in the right position. And then I forget what my next slide is. Oh, all right. Well, before we get there, the other part of executing this technique is the quote-unquote whip-like motion. So this is really a lot about keeping a loose wrist, which is somewhat awkward, but basically here's one thing to look out for. At the start of my swing, my racket is fairly upright, and this is the top of the racket, right? We continue with the video. Then at some point, my racket drops significantly. So the racket height went from somewhat upright to pretty far low. At this point, the racket is it's gonna be ready to hit the ball at waist height, whereas before it was really high up. So, we're wondering, how do we get the racket to go from high to low without using a loopy backswing? Well, the answer is you just keep a really loose wrist. So then basically right as I start the swing, my arm and my upper body begin the swing, and the wrist is so loose that the racket just drops behind. And then at the point of contact, Albert's got his elbow bent. My elbow is slightly bent as well, but my arm is a little bit straighter, and that's because at this point of the whip-like motion, the arm is starting to straighten out after just whipping it out. The arm is now straightening out. And just like with Albert, at some point there is quite a bit of lag with the racket and the arm. And then at the point of contact, the racket is facing the correct direction to hit the ball. As we follow through, my wrist is still pretty loose, and it allows the racket to do a kind of windshield wiper swiping motion. So kind of like an arc in this general direction. And then with the follow through, much like Albert, and his racket is facing to his left. My racket is also facing outward as well. Oh, I forgot to point out. So with the backswing, like the most obvious way to show it is if we draw a straight line through our bodies, then Albert's racket has been taken to the point where it crosses the line, and my racket never crosses the line. And that is kind of how you can that's like the easy way to appreciate the amount of time saved. Is Albert has to put or has to cover more ground, which takes time to do, whereas my racket kind of just stayed on one side of that that line. Okay, so going back to what's actually happening with the hitting of the ball, basically the loose wrist allows for the racket to do quite a bit of a windshield wiper swiping motion, and then the arm just sort of focuses on swinging through the ball to generate power. Whereas if we look at Albert's arm, at one point Albert's arm is pointing really downwards, right? And then it gets to the point where his arm is pointing upwards. So there's a lot of vertical movement with the arm, with the entire arm. Whereas my arm kind of stays in the horizontal plane quite a bit more than Albert's arm, which means my arm is more focused on adding power to the shot, and I let my wrist handle the responsibility of generating spin on the ball. Whereas Albert, yeah, his wrist is helping a little bit with the windshield wiper motion, but his arm is also helping with vertical motion to generate spin on the ball. But that means that it's a little bit harder to generate power. Okay, so what's the deal here? How come men use this technique? How come women don't use this technique? I don't know how much I really buy it, but it seems like the common explanation is that the modern technique requires more strength than the traditional textbook technique. And if I had to guess, I would say like, okay, maybe it's like an upper body strength thing, or maybe it's like a fast twitch muscle thing where there's a lot of focus on like very quick acceleration to generate the whip-like motion rather than having that loopy motion that we've talked about before, because the loopy motion is a little bit more manageable with less strength. Now that said, having a whip-like biomechanics means you basically just have less margin for error. You know, you need to, it's less sturdy, if you will, and therefore, if you hit the ball, it's gonna screw up more dramatically. It might be a little bit more stress on your elbow and your other joints if you mess up the shot. And on top of that, using an open stance with your feet is a little bit less natural in terms of balance, because like obviously everybody naturally goes into the closed stance position. And maybe it's a little bit more stress on my knees, because you see like how much my knees have to rotate there. But yeah, for the most part, it's just, in my opinion, the biggest thing is just that there's less margin for error. Everything is happening really quickly with the modern forehand, with that whip-like motion. Everything happens really quickly, and therefore the timing needs to be much more precise. Just like with Albert before in the last video, even though we were using Albert as the textbook example, there were some things that I critiqued about, or things that I criticized about his forehand. So I should also criticize my own forehand. Basically, one of the big things is that I hold onto the racket with my non-dominant hand when I take back the racket, when I'm doing my backswing, if you will. Technically not a backswing because there's no swinging involved. But when I take back the racket and I'm prepping for my forehand, I'm holding onto the racket here, which is kind of extreme. It's really not necessary. As long as the non-dominant arm is kind of pointing somewhere in the kind of general direction outward, then that's fine. And then the other thing is that my elbow with the tennis racket, my racket arm, the elbow is crossing the line of my body quite a bit, and I don't know, that might be a little bit too much. Let's see what else. Okay, so during the point of contact, I mentioned before that there's a little bit of elbow bend, but it's straightening out. But I think the idea is that the straighter the arm, that implies that you've done the whip-like motion with so much power that your arm has just naturally extended to be straighter if you do the whip-like motion more correctly. And then lastly, when it comes to the footwork of the follow-through, I'm lifting my back heel the same way that Albert is. But with an open stance, it might actually be okay to straight up lift the entire foot off the ground as necessary. But it kind of depends on the situation anyway. All right. Well, hopefully that wasn't too confusing.